In the cold silence of early night, a man hides in the shadows of a deserted alley. With a fixed stare, he follows a young woman walking alone toward a secluded shortcut. Unaware of the danger, she quickens her step through the dark walls of the alley. In a sharp move, the man blocks her path and reaches for his back pocket. A deep growl bursts through the walls, freezing him in place. From the shadows emerge bright eyes, white fangs, and heavy steps scraping the asphalt. For a moment, the entire world seemed to freeze. Love stories with animals? Then subscribe now and never miss one. Thanks for following us. Now, back to our story. The evening air in Cedar Falls, Montana, carried the familiar scent of pine and distant wood smoke as Sarah Mitchell walked along the familiar cobblestone path that wound through the heart of the small town. At 26, she had grown accustomed to the predictable rhythm of life in this peaceful community, where everyone knew their neighbors, and the most exciting news usually involved the local high school football team or the annual Harvest Festival. Sarah's footsteps echoed softly against the quiet streets as she made her way home from another long day at the Cedar Falls Wildlife Sanctuary, where she worked as the head animal care specialist. Her auburn hair caught the last rays of sunlight filtering through the maple trees that lined Main Street, and despite her fatigue, there was a contentment in her stride that spoke of someone who had found their true calling in life. The sanctuary had been her second home for the past 5 years, ever since she'd graduated from the University of Montana with a degree in wildlife biology. What had started as a summer internship had evolved into something much more meaningful, a place where she could channel her extraordinary gift with animals into something that truly mattered. The townspeople had long since stopped questioning Sarah's uncanny ability to calm even the most distressed creatures, accepting it as simply another part of what made their community special. As she passed Henderson's General Store, old Mr. Henderson waved from behind the counter, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "Evening, Sarah. How are our four-legged friends doing today?" "All settled in for the night, Mr. Henderson," she replied, pausing to return his wave. "Rex, the bear, is finally putting on weight, and the owl family seems to be adjusting well to their new enclosure." "That's wonderful to hear, dear. You have such a way with those animals. Your grandmother would be so proud." The mention of her grandmother brought a bittersweet smile to Sarah's face. Eleanor Mitchell had been the one to first recognize Sarah's gift when she was just 7 years old, watching in amazement as an injured deer had approached the young girl without fear, allowing her to examine its wounded leg. Eleanor had spent countless hours teaching Sarah about animal behavior, instilling in her the patience and respect that would later make her invaluable at the sanctuary. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson. Have a good evening," Sarah said, continuing. On her way, the streets of Cedar Falls were beginning to empty as the day workers headed home to their families. Sarah could see the warm glow of television screens flickering behind curtained windows, and the occasional sound of children's laughter drifted from backyards where families were enjoying the mild autumn evening. There was something deeply comforting about this routine, this sense of belonging to a community where everyone looked out for one another. As she turned onto Maple Street, Sarah's thoughts drifted to the events of the day. The sanctuary had received a new arrival, a young falcon with a damaged wing that had been found by a hiker near Glacier National Park. The bird had been severely traumatized, refusing to eat and showing signs of extreme stress. But when Sarah had approached its enclosure, something magical had happened. The falcon had immediately calmed, its wild eyes focusing on her with an intelligence that seemed almost human. Dr. Patricia Williamson, the sanctuary's veterinarian, had witnessed the interaction with her usual mixture of amazement and professional curiosity. "I've been working with animals for 30 years, Sarah, and I still can't explain what you do. It's like you speak their language." Sarah had laughed off the comment, as she always did when people tried to make her gift seem more mystical than it really was. To her, it felt as natural as breathing, a deep understanding of fear, pain, and the desire for safety that transcended species. She had learned to read the subtle signs that animals gave, to move with patience and respect, and most importantly, to approach each creature with genuine love and compassion. The sanctuary housed over 40 animals at any given time, from injured wildlife that would eventually be released back into the wild to permanent residents who had been rescued from illegal exotic pet trades or abusive situations. Each animal had its own story, its own journey of healing, and Sarah had been privileged to be part of that process for so many of them. As she approached the intersection of Maple and Pine Streets, Sarah noticed that the streetlights were beginning to flicker on, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. The familiar comfort of her routine was something she treasured, especially after the chaos and unpredictability that often characterized her workdays. No matter how challenging or emotionally draining a day at the sanctuary might be, she could always count on this peaceful walk home to center herself. Her small cottage sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, surrounded by a garden that she had carefully cultivated to attract local wildlife. Bird feeders hung from the oak trees in her front yard, and a small pond reflected the evening sky. It was a sanctuary in miniature, a place where she could continue her work even in her personal time. But as Sarah walked these familiar streets, she was unaware that her predictable routine had not gone unnoticed. For the past week, a figure had been observing her movements, noting the times she left work, the route she took home, and the quiet stretches of her journey where she was most vulnerable. Hidden in the shadows of doorways and behind parked cars, Marcus Thompson had been building a detailed picture of Sarah's daily life, driven by motivations that had nothing to do with the peaceful community of Cedar Falls. Marcus was not from this town. He had arrived 3 weeks ago, drawn by stories he had heard about the unusual wildlife sanctuary and the young woman who seemed to have an almost supernatural connection with animals. But his interest was not born of scientific curiosity or genuine concern for wildlife. Marcus was a man whose past was filled with decisions that had led him far from the path of honest living, and he had developed an obsession with rare and exotic animals that went far beyond appreciation. He had spent years moving from place to place, always searching for opportunities that would allow him to acquire the kinds of animals that commanded high prices in certain circles. When he had heard whispers about Cedar Falls and its sanctuary, particularly about rumors of animals that were far more exotic than typical wildlife rescue operations usually handled, he had decided to investigate. Sarah continued her walk, humming softly to herself as she approached the shortcut through the alley between Pine and Oak Streets. This narrow passage, flanked by the backs of local businesses, was the quickest way to reach her neighborhood, and she had used it countless times without a second thought. The alley was well lit and clean, maintained by the business owners who took pride in their community's appearance. Tonight, however, as she entered the alley, Sarah felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere. It was nothing she could put her finger on, perhaps a change in the usual sounds of the evening, or maybe just a sixth sense that came from spending so much time with animals, creatures that were naturally attuned to danger. She paused for a moment, looking around the familiar space, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. The feeling passed, and she continued walking, attributing her momentary unease to fatigue from a particularly demanding day. After all, Cedar Falls was one of the safest communities in Montana, with a crime rate so low that the local police department spent most of their time helping elderly residents with stuck cats and mediating disputes between neighbors over property lines. As Sarah emerged from the alley onto Oak Street, she took a deep breath of the cool evening air, feeling the last traces of her unexplained nervousness fade away. Tomorrow would bring new challenges at the sanctuary, new animals to care for, and new opportunities to make a difference in the lives of creatures that had nowhere else to turn. She had no way of knowing that tomorrow would indeed bring changes to her life, but not in any way she could have imagined. The quiet streets of Cedar Falls were about to become the stage for events that would test everything she believed about safety, community, and the extraordinary bond between humans and the animals they care for. The next morning brought the familiar sounds of awakening wildlife to the Cedar Falls Wildlife Sanctuary. Sarah arrived at dawn, as was her custom, carrying a steaming cup of coffee and a sense of anticipation for the day ahead. The sanctuary sprawled across 15 acres of carefully maintained habitat, with specialized enclosures designed to meet the unique needs of each resident. As she walked through the main compound, Sarah greeted each animal with the gentle attention that had become her trademark. The red-tailed hawks called out their recognition, while the family of rescued raccoons chattered excitedly at her approach. But her first stop, as always, was at the most secluded enclosure on the property, a specially designed habitat that was hidden from public view and known only to the sanctuary's core staff. "Good morning, Apollo," she whispered softly as she approached the enclosure. From the shadows of a carefully constructed den emerged a sight that would have taken the breath away from anyone fortunate enough to witness it. Apollo was a white lion, a creature so rare that fewer than 13 were believed to exist in the wild. His coat was not the golden amber of his more common cousins, but rather a stunning cream color that seemed to glow in the morning light. His eyes, a piercing blue that seemed to hold ancient wisdom, fixed on Sarah with an intensity that spoke of deep recognition and trust. The lion's presence at the sanctuary was the result of a rescue operation that had taken place 8 months earlier. Apollo had been discovered during a raid on an illegal exotic animal facility in Nevada, where he had been kept in deplorable conditions as part of a breeding program designed to produce rare animals for private collectors. The facility had been shut down by federal authorities, and Apollo, along with several other animals, had been placed in accredited sanctuaries across the country. Sarah had been specifically chosen to care for Apollo because of her reputation for working with traumatized exotic animals. When he had first arrived, the lion had been severely malnourished and psychologically damaged, exhibiting signs of stress and fear that broke Sarah's heart. He had refused to eat, cowered in the corner of his enclosure, and showed aggressive behavior toward anyone who approached. But Sarah had seen something different in Apollo's eyes during their first encounter. Beneath the fear and trauma, she had recognized a noble spirit that had been wounded but not broken. She had spent weeks sitting quietly outside his enclosure, reading books aloud, playing soft classical music, and simply being present without making any demands on the magnificent animal. The breakthrough had come on a rainy Tuesday morning 6 months ago. Sarah had arrived to find Apollo lying near the front of his enclosure, watching her with what seemed like curiosity rather than fear. When she had softly called his name, he had actually moved closer to the fence, studying her with those remarkable blue eyes. "You're ready to trust again, aren't you?" she had whispered, and to her amazement, Apollo had made a sound, not quite a roar, but a deep rumble that seemed to express agreement. From that day forward, their bond had grown stronger. Apollo had begun eating regularly. His coat had regained its lustrous sheen, and he had started displaying the confident, regal behavior that was natural to his species. More remarkably, he had developed what could only be described as a protective instinct towards Sarah, becoming agitated whenever unfamiliar people approached his enclosure when she was present. Dr. Williamson had been documenting their relationship for a research paper on human-animal bonds in exotic species. "What you've accomplished with Apollo is unprecedented," she had told Sarah just last week. "White lions are naturally more sensitive than their golden counterparts, and given his traumatic background, most experts would have predicted a much longer rehabilitation period if recovery was possible at all." Sarah unlocked the first gate of Apollo's double barrier enclosure system, a safety protocol required for all big cats. Apollo rose from his resting position and approached the inner fence, his massive frame moving with a grace that never failed to take her breath away. At 4 years old, he was approaching his full adult size, standing nearly 4 feet at the shoulder and weighing close to 400 pounds. "How are you feeling today, beautiful?" Sarah asked, pulling on her protective gloves as she prepared to enter the enclosure for their morning routine. Apollo's response was that same deep rumble she had come to recognize as his greeting. Unlike domestic cats, lions rarely purr, but Apollo had developed his own unique way of communicating contentment and affection. As Sarah entered the inner enclosure, Apollo approached her with the cautious respect they had established over months of careful interaction. The morning routine was always the same. Sarah would conduct a visual health check, looking for any signs of injury or illness, while Apollo would submit to her examination with a patience that amazed everyone who witnessed it. Then came feeding time, followed by enrichment activities designed to keep his mind and body active. "I have a surprise for you today," Sarah said, reaching into her bag to pull out a puzzle feeder she had designed specifically for Apollo. The device required him to manipulate different mechanisms to access treats hidden inside, providing mental stimulation that was crucial for an animal of his intelligence. As Apollo investigated the new toy with obvious interest, Sarah reflected on how their relationship had evolved beyond anything she had experienced with other animals. There was an almost telepathic quality to their communication, as if Apollo could sense her emotions and respond accordingly. On difficult days at the sanctuary, when other animals were struggling, or when the weight of caring for so many traumatized creatures became overwhelming, Apollo seemed to provide a calming presence that helped her find her center again. Dr. Williamson emerged from the veterinary clinic, coffee mug in hand, and approached Apollo's enclosure. "Good morning, you two. How's our special boy today?" "He seems particularly alert this morning," Sarah observed, watching as Apollo completed the puzzle feeder with impressive speed. "I think he's getting bored with his current enrichment activities. We might need to design something more challenging." "Speaking of challenges," Dr. Williamson said, her tone becoming more serious, "I wanted to talk to you about the increased interest we've been getting from unusual sources." Sarah looked up from where she was refilling Apollo's water dish. "What do you mean?" "I've been getting calls from people claiming to be researchers or documentary filmmakers, asking very specific questions about our exotic animal residents. Yesterday, someone called asking about white lions specifically, wanting to know if we had any and whether they might be available for educational programs." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. The illegal exotic animal trade was a constant threat to sanctuaries like theirs, and Apollo's rarity made him an especially valuable target. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing, of course. I told them we don't discuss specific animals with unknown parties and referred them to our public information on our website. But Sarah, I'm concerned. These weren't legitimate research inquiries. The questions were too specific, too focused on security measures and transport logistics." Apollo, as if sensing the change in the women's emotional states, moved to stand near Sarah, his massive head level with her shoulder. She instinctively placed a hand on his neck, feeling the comforting warmth of his presence. "We need to review our security protocols," Sarah said, her mind racing through possible vulnerabilities. "And maybe we should limit Apollo's outdoor time to daylight hours when more staff are present." "I've already contacted the local sheriff's department to increase their patrols around the sanctuary," Dr. Williamson said. "But I want you to be extra careful, especially during your evening walks home. If someone is specifically interested in Apollo, they might have been watching the facility, which means they could have noticed your routine." Sarah nodded, though part of her wondered if Dr. Williamson was being overly cautious. Cedar Falls had always been a safe haven, and the idea of someone actually attempting to steal one of their animals seemed almost impossible to imagine. Still, she had learned to trust the veterinarian's instincts over the years. As they discussed additional security measures, Apollo remained close to Sarah's side, his blue eyes scanning the perimeter of his enclosure with what seemed like heightened awareness. It was as if he understood that the conversation concerned his safety and was taking his own mental notes about potential threats. "There's something else," Dr. Williamson said quietly. "The caller yesterday mentioned you by name. He asked specifically about the young woman who works so closely with the dangerous animals. And that suggests a level of surveillance that goes beyond casual interest." The implication hit Sarah like a physical blow. If someone had been watching the sanctuary closely enough to identify her specifically, it meant her own safety might be at risk as well. The thought of anyone using her as leverage to get to Apollo filled her with a protective fury that surprised her with its intensity. Apollo seemed to sense her emotional state and moved even closer until his shoulder was pressed against her arm. The gesture was unmistakably protective, and Sarah realized that their bond had evolved into something far deeper than a typical caretaker-animal relationship. They had become partners in each other's well-being, each attuned to the other's needs and emotions. "We'll figure this out," Sarah said, speaking as much to Apollo as to Dr. Williamson. "No one is going to hurt him or take him away from here. This is his home now, and he's safe." As she spoke the words, Sarah felt the weight of a promise she was making not just to Apollo, but to herself. Whatever threats might be lurking in the shadows of their peaceful community, she was prepared to face them. Apollo had survived the trauma of his early life and found healing at the sanctuary. She would not allow anyone to destroy the progress he had made or the life they had built together. Little did she know that the very person they needed to worry about was already much closer than any of them realized, and that the peaceful routine of Cedar Falls was about to be shattered in ways that would test the extraordinary bond between a young woman and the magnificent creature who had chosen to trust her with his life. Marcus Thompson sat in his rented sedan across the street from the Cedar Falls Wildlife Sanctuary, a pair of high-powered binoculars focused on the main compound. He had been parked here for over an hour, watching the morning routines of the staff and noting the security measures that protected the facility. From his vantage point, he could see most of the animal enclosures, but there was one section of the property that remained frustratingly hidden from view, a heavily wooded area with what appeared to be specialized fencing. For 3 weeks, Marcus had been gathering intelligence on the sanctuary and its operations. He had posed as a nature photographer to gain access to public tours, studied the staff schedules from multiple vantage points around town, and even engaged in casual conversations with locals to learn more about the facility's reputation and the woman who seemed to be at the center of it all. Sarah Mitchell had become his primary focus, not just because of her role at the sanctuary, but because of the stories he had heard about her unusual connection with the animals. Several people in town had mentioned her almost supernatural ability to calm even the most aggressive creatures, and Marcus had witnessed enough during his surveillance to know that these weren't just small-town exaggerations. Yesterday morning, he had watched through his binoculars as Sarah had approached an enclosure hidden among the trees at the back of the property. Even from a distance, he had caught a glimpse of something that had made his pulse quicken, a flash of pale fur that was unlike any of the typical wildlife species the sanctuary was known to house. When Sarah had emerged from that area an hour later, her demeanor had been different, more protective, as if she had just left something precious behind. Marcus had built his entire adult life around identifying and acquiring rare animals for clients who were willing to pay extraordinary sums for the privilege of owning something that few others could possess. Over the years, he had developed an extensive network of contacts who supplied him with information about potential acquisitions. And it was through these channels that he had first heard whispers about Cedar Falls. The information had been vague. At first, rumors about a small sanctuary in Montana that was housing something exceptional, something that would be worth the considerable risk involved in acquiring it. Marcus had almost dismissed the lead, as rural wildlife sanctuaries rarely had anything more exotic than injured eagles or orphaned bear cubs. But the source of the information had been reliable in the past, and the suggestion that the animal in question was worth more than anything Marcus had ever handled had been enough to motivate this extended reconnaissance mission. Now, after weeks of careful observation, Marcus was convinced that his source had been accurate. The level of security around the sanctuary's back section, the way Sarah Mitchell moved with obvious purpose toward that hidden enclosure every morning, and the glimpses he had caught of something extraordinary all pointed to the presence of an animal that would command astronomical prices in the right market. Marcus had done his research on Sarah Mitchell as well, 26 years old, a local girl who had grown up in Cedar Falls before leaving for college and returning to work at the sanctuary. She lived alone in a small cottage on the outskirts of town, followed predictable routines, and seemed to have few close relationships outside of her work. Most importantly, she appeared to be the primary caretaker for whatever special animal the sanctuary was harboring. The plan that had been forming in Marcus's mind was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than attempting to breach the sanctuary's security directly, a risky proposition given the federal oversight that likely protected any exotic animals, he would focus on Sarah herself. If she was as devoted to the animals as everyone claimed, she would be willing to cooperate to ensure their safety. A carefully orchestrated encounter, combined with the right kind of pressure, would give him the access he needed. Marcus lowered his binoculars and checked his watch. Sarah's morning routine at the sanctuary typically lasted until early afternoon, after which she would return home via her usual route through town. He had mapped every street she used, timed her walking pace, and identified several locations where she would be isolated from potential witnesses. The alley between Pine and Oak Streets had emerged as the ideal location for his plan. It was well lit enough that Sarah wouldn't feel suspicious about using it, but isolated enough that their encounter wouldn't be interrupted. The businesses that backed up to the alley were closed by evening, and foot traffic in that area was minimal after dark. Marcus started his car and drove slowly through downtown Cedar Falls, reviewing the details of his strategy. One more time. He had no intention of harming Sarah. That would be counterproductive and would only complicate his ultimate goal. Instead, he planned to present himself as someone with legitimate business interests, someone who was willing to make her an offer that would benefit both the sanctuary and herself. He had prepared a cover story about representing a private zoological facility that specialized in breeding programs for endangered species. The story was plausible enough to withstand casual scrutiny, and it provided a reasonable explanation for his interest in acquiring rare animals. If Sarah proved receptive to negotiation, the entire transaction could be completed without any unpleasantness. As he drove past the sandwich shop where Sarah often stopped for lunch, Marcus caught sight of her distinctive auburn hair through the window. She was sitting alone at a corner table, reading what appeared to be a veterinary journal. While eating, even from this brief glimpse, Marcus could see the focused intensity that everyone in town commented on when they spoke about her work. Marcus parked his car and decided to observe her lunch routine, adding another piece to his comprehensive understanding of her daily patterns. Through the window, he watched as Sarah interacted with the shop's staff, noting the genuine warmth of their exchanges and the obvious respect that the local community had for her work. A young waitress approached Sarah's table with a coffee refill, and Marcus could see them talking animatedly about something. The waitress was gesturing excitedly, and Sarah was nodding with the patient attention that seemed to characterize all of her interactions. It occurred to Marcus that this level of community integration would make Sarah's disappearance much more noticeable, which meant his timeline for any negotiation would need to be carefully managed. As Sarah finished her lunch and prepared to leave, Marcus made note of her next destination. She walked 3 blocks to the local feed store, where she spent 20 minutes selecting supplies that were undoubtedly for the sanctuary's animals. The store owner, an elderly man with weathered hands, helped her load several heavy bags into her truck with the casual familiarity of someone who had been providing this service for years. Marcus followed at a discreet distance as Sarah drove back to the sanctuary, noting that she took the same route she always used and maintained consistent speeds. Her predictability was both an asset for his planning and a potential vulnerability that concerned him. Someone with her level of responsibility for valuable animals should have been more security conscious, more aware of potential threats. Back at the sanctuary, Marcus resumed his observation post and watched as Sarah unloaded the supplies and disappeared into the main building. Through his binoculars, he could see her moving through the compound, stopping at various enclosures to check on different animals. But it was her final stop that held his complete attention. That mysterious back section where something extraordinary was waiting. This time, Marcus was ready with his camera as well as his binoculars. As Sarah approached the hidden enclosure, he focused his telephoto lens and waited. When she emerged into a small clearing, Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat. Walking beside her, with a majesty that was unmistakable even from this distance, was a white lion. Marcus had seen photographs of white lions before, had even handled negotiations for one several years ago, but seeing this magnificent creature in person was something entirely different. The animal moved with obvious comfort around Sarah, and Marcus could see them interacting with a familiarity that spoke of deep trust and affection. The financial implications of his discovery hit Marcus like a physical force. White lions were among the rarest animals on Earth, worth more than any single acquisition he had ever attempted. The right collector would pay virtually any price to own such a creature, especially one that was already socialized to human contact. As Marcus watched Sarah and the lion through his camera lens, he began to understand why the sanctuary had gone to such lengths to keep this animal's presence secret. The federal regulations governing the ownership and transport of exotic animals were complex and strictly enforced. But Marcus had navigated those waters before. With the right documentation and the proper channels, even a white lion could be relocated if the transaction was handled correctly. Marcus spent the remainder of the afternoon refining his approach strategy. The key would be convincing Sarah that his offer was legitimate and that cooperating with him would actually benefit the lion's long-term welfare. He had used similar arguments successfully in the past, appealing to caretakers' genuine concern for their animals' well-being while downplaying the financial motivations that actually drove his business. As evening approached and Sarah began her routine of securing the sanctuary for the night, Marcus drove to the alley between Pine and Oak Streets to conduct a final reconnaissance of his chosen encounter location. The lighting was exactly as he had remembered, and the acoustics would allow for private conversation without raising concerns about being overheard. Everything was falling into place for tomorrow evening's approach. Sarah's schedule was predictable. The location was ideal, and Marcus had crafted what he believed to be an irresistible proposition. He was confident that within 24 hours he would be making arrangements for the acquisition of the most valuable animal he had ever handled. What Marcus had not anticipated, however, was that his weeks of careful surveillance had not gone completely unnoticed. The same instincts that made Sarah so effective with traumatized animals had begun to register the subtle changes in her environment, the feeling of being watched that had started to intrude on her consciousness during her evening walks home. More importantly, Marcus had no understanding of the true depth of the bond between Sarah and Apollo, or the protective instincts that their relationship had awakened in the magnificent white lion. Tomorrow evening's encounter would indeed change everything in Cedar Falls, but not in any way that Marcus Thompson could have possibly imagined. The following evening arrived with an unusual stillness that seemed to settle over Cedar Falls like a heavy blanket. Sarah had spent the day at the sanctuary dealing with a medical emergency involving one of the rehabilitating hawks, and the stress of the situation had left her feeling more drained than usual as she began her walk home through the familiar streets of downtown. As she passed the various shops and businesses that formed the heart of her community, Sarah found herself thinking about Dr. Williamson's warnings from the previous day. The increased interest from suspicious callers had been troubling, but in the peaceful atmosphere of Cedar Falls, it was difficult to imagine any real threat materializing. Still, she had found herself paying more attention to her surroundings lately, noticing details that had previously escaped her attention. Tonight, that heightened awareness was picking up subtle signals that something felt different. The usual evening sounds seemed muted, and she had the distinct impression that she was being observed, though she couldn't identify any specific source of her unease. Sarah paused outside the hardware store and pretended to examine the display window while actually scanning the reflections for any sign of unusual activity behind her. Nothing appeared out of the ordinary, but the feeling persisted as she continued. Toward the intersection of Pine and Oak Streets, the alley that provided her usual shortcut home stretched ahead of her, its familiar lighting creating pools of illumination along the path. Sarah had used this route hundreds of times without incident, but tonight something made her hesitate at the entrance. For a moment, she considered taking the longer route around the block, but she immediately dismissed the thought as paranoid foolishness. This was Cedar Falls, not some dangerous urban environment where people needed to fear walking alone at night. She had grown up in this community, and these streets were as safe as her own home. Sarah entered the alley with determined steps, reminding herself that allowing unfounded fears to change her behavior would be giving into exactly the kind of anxiety that Dr. Williamson's warnings had been intended to prevent, not create. As she walked, she focused on the sound of her footsteps, echoing off the brick walls of the surrounding buildings, using the familiar rhythm to calm her nerves. She was halfway through the alley when a figure stepped out from the shadows near the back of Murphy's restaurant. Sarah's heart rate immediately accelerated, but she forced herself to maintain a steady pace while evaluating the situation. The man appeared to be in his late 30s, average height and build, wearing dark clothing that had allowed him to blend into the shadows. "Excuse me, Miss Mitchell," the man said, his voice carrying a studied casualness that immediately put Sarah on high alert. "I was hoping I might have a word with you." The fact that he knew her name sent a chill down Sarah's spine, but she maintained her composure while her mind raced through possible responses. "I'm sorry, but I don't believe we've been introduced," she said, stopping but keeping a safe distance between them. "My name is Marcus Thompson," he replied, taking a step closer. "I represent the Apex Conservation Foundation, and I've been hoping to discuss a business proposition with you regarding the Cedar Falls Wildlife Sanctuary." Sarah's training in animal behavior had taught her to trust her instincts about potential threats, and every sense she possessed was warning her that this encounter was not what it appeared to be. Marcus Thompson's body language, his choice of location, and the timing of his approach all suggested someone who was accustomed to operating outside normal channels. "If you have legitimate business with the sanctuary, you should contact Dr. Williamson during normal business hours," Sarah said firmly, beginning to move toward the exit of the alley. "I don't discuss sanctuary operations with unknown parties." Marcus moved to block her path, and Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she realized that her initial instincts had been correct. "I think you'll find my offer very compelling, Miss Mitchell. We're prepared to make a substantial donation to your facility in exchange for access to some of your more unique residents." The way he emphasized the word unique left no doubt in Sarah's mind about his true intentions. This was exactly the kind of person Dr. Williamson had warned her about, someone who was interested in acquiring Apollo for illegal purposes. Sarah's protective instincts flared to life, and she felt a surge of anger that surprised her with its intensity. "I don't know what you think you know about our animals," Sarah said, her voice taking on a steely edge that she hadn't known she possessed. "But the Cedar Falls Wildlife Sanctuary does not negotiate with anyone regarding the acquisition of our residents. Now please step aside and let me pass." Marcus's friendly facade began to slip, revealing something harder and more calculating underneath. "I'm afraid I can't do that, Miss Mitchell. You see, I've invested considerable time and resources in learning about your operation, and I'm not prepared to leave empty-handed. Your cooperation would make this much easier for everyone involved." Sarah's mind raced through her limited options. The alley had seemed like a trap from the moment Marcus had appeared, and she was beginning to understand that this encounter had been carefully planned. Her phone was in her purse, but Marcus was close enough to prevent her from reaching it before he could intervene. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Sarah asked, playing for time while looking for any opportunity to escape or call for help. "I'm suggesting that you arrange for me to have access to your white lion," Marcus said, abandoning any pretense about his real intentions. "I have clients who are willing to pay extraordinary sums for such a rare specimen, and I'm prepared to share a portion of that compensation with you and your sanctuary." The casual way he mentioned Apollo by species sent a wave of fury through Sarah that was unlike anything she had ever experienced. The idea that someone would view Apollo, with all of his trauma and hard-won progress toward healing, as nothing more than a commodity to be bought and sold, filled her with a protective rage that momentarily overwhelmed her fear. "You have no idea what you're talking about," Sarah said, her voice shaking with emotion. "That animal has been through hell, and he's finally found peace and safety. I will never, under any circumstances, allow you or anyone else to exploit him for profit." Marcus's expression hardened further, and Sarah realized that she had just confirmed not only Apollo's presence at the sanctuary, but also her own deep emotional investment in his welfare. She had given him exactly the leverage he had been hoping to find. I was hoping we could reach an amicable agreement, Marcus said, moving closer. But your emotional attachment to the animal actually makes this easier. You see, Miss Mitchell, you're going to help me acquire that lion whether you want to or not, because the alternative would be very unpleasant for both you and your precious sanctuary. Sarah's training kicked in, and she began to assess Marcus as she would any dangerous animal, looking for signs of his next move, calculating distances to potential escape routes, and preparing to defend herself if necessary. But before she could formulate a plan of action, a sound echoed through the alley that froze both her and Marcus in place. It was a roar, but unlike any sound that most people would ever hear in their lifetime. Deep, primal, and carrying a resonance that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the alley. It was the voice of a creature that commanded respect through sheer presence alone. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling the enclosed space with an acoustic power that was both magnificent and terrifying. Marcus's confident demeanor evaporated instantly, replaced by confusion and the beginning of genuine fear. What the hell was that? He whispered, his head swiveling as he tried to identify the source of the sound. Sarah felt her heart leap with a mixture of hope and concern as she realized what was happening. Somehow, against all logic, and despite the distance from the sanctuary, Apollo had found her. The protective bond they had developed over months of careful interaction had manifested in a way that transcended her understanding of animal behavior. From the shadows at the far end of the alley, a pale form emerged with fluid grace. Apollo stepped into the light, his magnificent coat seeming to glow under the street lamps, his blue eyes fixed with laser intensity on Marcus Thompson. The white lion moved with purpose, each step calculated and deliberate, positioning himself between Sarah and the man who had threatened her. Marcus stumbled backward, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. "This isn't possible," he stammered, his voice cracking under the strain of what he was witnessing. "Lions don't... they can't just appear in town. This isn't real." But Apollo was undeniably real and undeniably present. At 400 pounds of muscle and instinct, he represented a force of nature that reduced Marcus's carefully laid plans to irrelevant fragments. The lion's presence transformed the entire dynamic of the encounter, shifting the balance of power so completely that Marcus found himself backing against the brick wall of the alley, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. Apollo approached to within 10 feet of Marcus and stopped, settling into a crouch that every human instinct recognized as the position a predator assumed before striking. His blue eyes never wavered from Marcus's face, and a low growl rumbled from his chest, a sound that conveyed a promise of consequences if the threat to Sarah continued. Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions as she watched Apollo protect her with the same fierce loyalty she had shown him during his darkest days at the sanctuary. The bond between them had evolved into something that transcended the typical relationship between human and animal, creating a partnership based on mutual respect, trust, and genuine affection. "Apollo," she said softly, not wanting to break the spell of the moment, but needing to communicate with her guardian. The lion's ears swiveled toward her voice, though his eyes remained fixed on Marcus. "I'm safe now. Thank you for coming." The magnificent creature's response was that familiar, deep rumble that Sarah had learned to interpret as acknowledgement and affection. Apollo had not only found her in her moment of greatest need, but had arrived with perfect timing to prevent Marcus from carrying out whatever plan he had devised. The alley fell into an eerie silence, broken only by Marcus's labored breathing, and the soft padding of Apollo's paws against the pavement as the magnificent lion adjusted his position. Sarah watched in fascination as Apollo demonstrated the same patient intelligence he had shown during his rehabilitation, using his natural authority to control the situation without resorting to aggression. Marcus remained pressed against the brick wall, his earlier confidence completely shattered by the appearance of a creature he had viewed as nothing more than a valuable commodity. The reality of facing 400 pounds of apex predator in a confined space had stripped away all of his carefully constructed plans, leaving him with nothing but the primitive human fear of being prey. "Please," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean any harm. I was just trying to make a business arrangement." Apollo's response was a slight shift in position that somehow managed to convey both skepticism and warning. The lion's blue eyes remained fixed on Marcus with an intensity that seemed to peer directly into his soul, evaluating the sincerity of his plea and finding it lacking. Sarah realized that this was a moment of profound communication between human and animal, a demonstration of the protective bond that she and Apollo had developed over months of mutual trust and respect. The lion had not only recognized her distress from a distance that should have made such awareness impossible, but had also navigated the streets of Cedar Falls to reach her at precisely the right moment. "How did you know?" Sarah asked Apollo, softly, though she didn't expect an answer. "How did you know I needed you?" Apollo's ears swiveled toward her voice, and for just a moment his attention shifted from Marcus to Sarah. In that brief exchange of glances, Sarah saw something that went beyond simple animal instinct or even the deepest human-animal bond she had ever witnessed. There was an intelligence in Apollo's eyes that seemed to acknowledge her question and suggest that some connections transcended rational explanation. Marcus, seeing Apollo's momentary distraction, made the mistake of trying to edge along the wall toward what he hoped might be an escape route. The movement was subtle, barely perceptible, but Apollo's attention snapped back to him instantly. This time, the lion's response was more dramatic, a controlled leap that closed half the distance between them in a single, fluid motion. The display of power was breathtaking. Apollo moved with a grace that belied his massive size, demonstrating the perfect coordination of muscle and instinct that made lions such effective predators. But more importantly, his movement was precisely calculated to intimidate without, actually endangering Marcus. Apollo had positioned himself to block any possible escape route while maintaining enough distance to avoid direct physical contact. Marcus collapsed to his knees, his legs unable to support him in the face of such overwhelming natural authority. "I'm sorry," he gasped, tears streaming down his face. "I never meant for this to happen. I needed the money. I have debts, people who will hurt me if I don't pay them back." For the first time since the encounter began, Sarah felt a flicker of sympathy for Marcus, though it was tempered by her anger at his willingness to exploit Apollo for his own financial problems. "That doesn't give you the right to threaten animals who have already suffered enough," she said firmly. "Apollo was rescued from people just like you, people who saw him as nothing more than a way to make money." Apollo seemed to sense the shift in Sarah's emotional state and responded by settling into a more relaxed position, though he remained alert and ready to respond if Marcus made any threatening moves. The lion's behavior demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of the situation that went far beyond simple protective instinct. "I don't understand," Marcus said, his voice shaking. "How is he here? How did a lion get through town without anyone seeing? This is impossible." Sarah realized that Marcus was struggling to process what he was witnessing because it challenged everything he thought he knew about animal behavior and the boundaries between wild and domestic creatures. Apollo's presence in the alley represented something that existed outside normal categories, a bond between human and animal that had evolved into a form of partnership that most people would find difficult to believe. Apollo chose to trust me when he had every reason to fear humans, Sarah explained, keeping her voice calm and steady. I spent months earning that trust by showing him that not all people are cruel or exploitative. What you're seeing now is his way of returning that care and protection. As if to confirm her words, Apollo moved closer to Sarah, close enough that she could place her hand on his shoulder. The gesture was casual, natural, and spoke of a level of comfort and mutual respect that had been built through countless hours of patient interaction. Marcus watched this display of affection with obvious amazement. I've never seen anything like this, he admitted. In all my years of dealing with exotic animals, I've never encountered a bond like what you two have. That's because you've only seen animals as commodities, Sarah replied. You've never taken the time to understand them as individuals with their own personalities, needs, and capacity for relationships. Apollo isn't just a rare white lion. He's a unique individual who has overcome tremendous trauma to learn to trust again. The sound of approaching sirens began to echo through the streets of Cedar Falls, and Sarah realized that someone must have heard Apollo's initial roar and called the authorities. She pulled her phone from her purse and quickly dialed Dr. Williamson's number, knowing that the veterinarian's presence would be crucial for managing the situation with local law enforcement. Dr. Williamson, it's Sarah, she said when the call connected. I need you to come to the alley between Pine and Oak Streets immediately. Apollo is with me, and we have a situation that's going to require your help to explain to the police. Apollo's ears perked up at the sound of Dr. Williamson's name, and he made that familiar rumbling sound that Sarah had learned to interpret as recognition and approval. Even in this unusual situation, the lion maintained his awareness of the people who formed his extended pack at the sanctuary. The sirens grew louder, and Sarah could see the flashing lights of police cruisers reflecting off the windows of the buildings that surrounded the alley. Within minutes, the narrow space would be filled with law enforcement officers who would be completely unprepared for what they were about to encounter. Marcus, Sarah said, addressing the man who was still kneeling on the ground, when the police arrive, you're going to tell them exactly what you told me about your intentions regarding Apollo. You're going to explain about your surveillance of the sanctuary and your plan to acquire him illegally, and you're going to cooperate fully with whatever investigation follows. Marcus nodded frantically, clearly understanding that his cooperation was his only hope of emerging from this situation without facing even more serious consequences. Yes, of course. I'll tell them everything. I just want this to be over. Apollo remained positioned between Sarah and Marcus, but his posture had relaxed slightly as the immediate threat diminished. The lion's behavior demonstrated a remarkable ability to assess and respond to changing circumstances, adjusting his level of alertness based on the evolving dynamics of the situation. The first police cruiser arrived at the mouth of the alley, its spotlight illuminating the extraordinary scene. Officer Jennifer Rodriguez, a 10-year veteran of the Cedar Falls Police Department, stepped out of her vehicle and immediately stopped in her tracks when she saw Apollo. "Dear God," she whispered, her hand instinctively moving toward her radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12. I'm going to need backup, and someone needs to contact the wildlife authorities immediately. We have a situation here that's, well, it's unlike anything I've ever encountered." Sarah stepped forward, keeping her hand on Apollo's shoulder to maintain the physical connection that seemed to anchor their communication. "Officer Rodriguez, my name is Sarah Mitchell from the Cedar Falls Wildlife Sanctuary. This is Apollo, one of our residents, and the man on the ground attempted to coerce me into helping him acquire Apollo illegally. Officer Rodriguez looked from Sarah to Apollo to Marcus, clearly struggling to process the information she was receiving. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to explain how a lion came to be in downtown Cedar Falls, and I'm going to need everyone to remain very calm while we sort this out." Dr. Williamson's truck arrived at that moment, and the veterinarian hurried toward the alley with the confident stride of someone accustomed to managing unusual situations. "Officer Rodriguez, I'm Dr. Patricia Williamson, the head veterinarian at the sanctuary. I can provide you with all the documentation you need to verify Apollo's legal status and explain how he came to be here." Apollo's recognition of Dr. Williamson was immediate and obvious. The lion's entire demeanor shifted from protective alertness to something approaching relaxation. Though he remained close to Sarah's side, the arrival of another member of his trusted pack seemed to provide additional reassurance that the situation was under control. As more police officers arrived and began establishing a perimeter around the alley, Sarah marveled at how Apollo adapted to each new development. The lion showed no signs of stress or aggression toward the officers, seeming to understand that they represented help rather than threat. His behavior was a testament to the rehabilitation work that had transformed him from a traumatized captive animal into a confident individual capable of complex social interactions. The most remarkable aspect of the entire encounter was how Apollo had managed to neutralize Marcus's threat without resorting to violence. Through presence alone, the sheer force of his natural authority and the obvious strength of his bond with Sarah, Apollo had accomplished what would have been impossible through confrontation or aggression. Within hours of the extraordinary encounter in the alley, news of Apollo's protective intervention had spread throughout Cedar Falls and beyond. Officer Rodriguez found herself struggling to write a report that adequately captured what she had witnessed, while her radio call to dispatch became part of a story that would capture national attention. Dr. Williamson worked efficiently with local authorities to establish the legal framework for Apollo's safe return to the sanctuary. Marcus Thompson was taken into custody on charges related to illegal wildlife trafficking, his confession revealing connections to a broader network that federal authorities had been investigating for months. 3 months later, Sarah stood at the new viewing platform that had been constructed to accommodate visitors from around the world. The Cedar Falls Wildlife Sanctuary had been transformed, receiving donations that allowed them to create expanded habitats while maintaining the highest standards of animal care. "The story has changed everything," Dr. Williamson said, joining Sarah at the observation deck. "We've received inquiries from sanctuaries on every continent, all wanting to understand how you achieved such remarkable results with Apollo." Apollo moved through his enlarged habitat with confident grace, his magnificent coat gleaming in the afternoon sun. The sanctuary now housed additional rescued animals, and Apollo had become an ambassador not just for his own species, but for the healing power of human-animal bonds. The impact had been far-reaching. Marcus Thompson's arrest had led to the shutdown of illegal trafficking operations across 7 states, saving hundreds of animals from exploitation. More importantly, Apollo's story had inspired new approaches to animal rehabilitation that emphasized emotional healing alongside physical care. Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from her publisher about the book she had written documenting their journey together. The Language of Trust, a journey of healing with a white lion, was already generating international interest, with pre-orders exceeding all expectations. "There's an opportunity I wanted to discuss," Dr. Williamson said. "The international wildlife Conservation Alliance has offered you a position as their global ambassador for exotic animal rehabilitation. They want you and Apollo to travel together, sharing your methods with sanctuaries worldwide. The idea filled Sarah with excitement and purpose to travel the world with Apollo, helping other traumatized animals find healing, represented the perfect evolution of their partnership. As evening approached, Sarah made her way to Apollo's habitat for their daily walk. This routine had been maintained throughout all the changes, providing the consistent connection that anchored their relationship. Apollo greeted her with obvious pleasure, pressing his massive head against her shoulder in their trademark greeting. They walked together through the sanctuary grounds, Apollo moving with unleashed confidence while remaining perfectly attuned to Sarah's pace. Visitors often commented on the obvious communication between them, the way they seemed to anticipate each other's movements through subtle cues invisible to outside observers. "Do you know what I've learned from all of this?" Sarah said as they paused at their favorite overlook point. "I thought I was rescuing you, helping you heal from trauma. But you've shown me that the connections we make can literally change the world." Apollo responded by moving closer, leaning against Sarah's side with casual affection that spoke of complete trust and security. As they returned to Apollo's habitat, Sarah noticed a family lingering after viewing hours. A mother and father stood with their teenage daughter in a wheelchair, watching Apollo with expressions of wonder and hope. "Excuse me," the mother called softly. "My daughter Emma has been following Apollo's story since the beginning. She's been through difficult times herself, and Apollo has become a symbol of hope for her. Would it be possible for her to meet him?" Sarah looked at Apollo, who had already noticed the family and was regarding them with alert interest. She could see he was comfortable with their presence. "Of course," Sarah said, opening the viewing area gate. "Apollo loves meeting people, especially young people who understand overcoming challenges." Emma's face transformed with joy as Apollo approached the fence. The magnificent lion studied the girl with those remarkable blue eyes, then lay down at the fence line, positioning himself so Emma could easily see him and reach through to touch his fur. "He knows," Emma whispered, tears streaming as she gently touched Apollo's coat. "He knows what it's like to learn everything over again, to find new ways to be strong." In that moment, Sarah understood the true significance of everything that had happened since that night in the alley. Apollo's protective intervention had saved her from danger, but more importantly, it had created a story of hope that resonated with people worldwide who needed reminding that healing was possible. As the family said their goodbyes, Sarah sat beside Apollo in the gathering darkness. Tomorrow would bring new visitors, new stories of how Apollo had inspired hope in people facing their own challenges, and new opportunities to share their message of healing and trust. The quiet streets of Cedar Falls had been forever changed by extraordinary events that began with a threat in a darkened alley and evolved into a story touching millions of lives. Apollo's journey from traumatized captive to confident protector and ambassador taught the world that healing is always possible, that genuine connections can transcend any barrier, and that sometimes the most powerful protection comes not from force, but from the simple presence of someone who truly cares. Their story had become a beacon of hope, proving that trust built through patient consistency, respect offered without conditions, and love expressed through countless small acts of care could transform not just individual lives, but entire communities and beyond. The sanctuary had become a pilgrimage site for those seeking inspiration, a place where the extraordinary bond between Sarah and Apollo demonstrated daily that remarkable healing becomes possible when compassion bridges the gaps between different worlds. As Sarah Prepared for their new journey as global ambassadors, she reflected on how their quiet life had transformed into something that touched people worldwide. The phone calls and interview requests would continue. New challenges awaited as they navigated their role as international symbols of hope. But tonight, in the sanctuary that had become Apollo's true home, Sarah felt deep satisfaction knowing their story inspired hope and wonder in countless people who needed reminding that extraordinary bonds of loyalty and protection were still possible. Apollo's protective roar in that alley had echoed far beyond Cedar Falls, carrying a message about the power of compassion, the importance of protecting those who cannot protect themselves, and the remarkable connections that develop when trust transcends the boundaries between species. Their story would continue to ripple outward, touching lives and inspiring healing in ways they were only beginning to understand. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of Sarah and Apollo has moved your hearts and reminded you of the extraordinary bonds that can develop when trust and compassion overcome fear and trauma. Like Emma, countless people around the world have found hope and inspiration in Apollo's journey from a traumatized captive to a confident protector and ambassador. Their story teaches us that healing is always possible, that genuine connections can transcend any barrier, and that sometimes the most powerful protection comes not from force, but from the simple presence of someone who truly cares. If this story of transformation and unbreakable loyalty has touched you, we invite you to share it with others who might need reminding that extraordinary love and protection still exist in our world. Please subscribe to our channel for more stories that celebrate the incredible resilience of the human and animal spirit. Leave a like if Apollo's courage inspired you, and tell us in the comments about the loyal protectors in your own life. These stories matter because they remind us of who we can be at our very best, and every share helps spread hope to someone who needs it today.